Welcome to VikeFans.com's exclusive series, Jay's All Out Blitz, a look inside the key challenges and issues facing NFL players and the Minnesota Vikings in 2013. And now, your host, former NFL linebacker, Jay Foreman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second edition of Jay Foreman's All Out Blitz series. I'm Tom Moore, better known to most of you as Purple Pain. I'm joined, as always, by former NFL linebacker, Jay Foreman. Jay, how's your week been treating you?
It's been pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. We've got a lot to talk about because, unfortunately, last week was a relatively ragged performance the Vikings turned in preseason game number 2 in Buffalo. So I say we just dive in, Jay.
Yeah, I think we should, too. I think there's a lot to discuss and learn from last week, too.
Okay. Well, after the first preseason game when the Vikings looked pretty good against the Texans, Minnesota looked really, really flat against Buffalo, and the offensive line seemed literally incapable of picking up the Bills' aggressive blitzing scheme on defense. Jay, what went wrong, and is this a cause for concern for Viking fans at this stage of the season?
No, not really. The Vikings have a established veteran offensive line, probably one of the top 5 to 7 offensive lines in the league. I think it's just a difference in philosophy in the preseason. I think the Vikings were very vanilla. They've been going against each other in practice. I think the Bills came out and approached it like it was a regular season game. You saw all different types of blitz schemes. You saw 4-3, 3-4, 5-2, even 2-4 with 5 defensive backs. So I think it was something more of a shock to their system, and I think it's something that obviously they've learned from. As far as them being flat, I just think that's the hardest game for a team to play as a second preseason game, because you have the excitement for the first one, and then you go right back into 2-a-days, and then you have another game. So it's hard to get up to that second one. But leading into the third week, you'll see practices being more intense. You'll see guys more game-like with their focus and preparation, because that third game is the last dress rehearsal before the season starts, and so it's going to be played by the starters the majority of the time.
Well, after the game, Coach Leslie Frazier, he seemed upset that the Bills were blitzing so much in a preseason affair, and he even said so in the press conference that the Vikings didn't expect the style. So my question to you is, even though the Viking game plan didn't prepare for such a heavy blitzing scheme, shouldn't a coach adjust to his game to protect his quarterback and his running backs? And I ask this because there's been a long-standing complaint by fans in the media about this staff struggling to make in-game adjustments.
Yeah, there's an unwritten rule that's been in the NFL for probably ages, where in the preseason, you don't really do a lot of blitzing, you don't do a lot of complicated schemes, because coaches and coaching staff and organizations are trying to evaluate their players. So what they're doing is they're trying to dummy down their playbook enough to where they can see these guys perform at their peak performance. Obviously, when Minnesota played Buffalo, I think that was thrown out the window, and so you see the difference between Leslie Frazier, who's been a head coach in the NFL coaching for a long time, versus Doug Marrone, who's a new up-and-coming coach that wants to prove himself, that's not going to try to back down from anybody, but is trying to build a culture in Buffalo that every game means something. And not saying it doesn't mean nothing to the Vikings, but the Vikings were going along with the regular path of how the NFL approaches the second preseason game, versus Buffalo approaching it like more of it like the first in a regular season game. And that was just really the biggest difference. I think it was just a difference in philosophy. I'm going to assume that the coaches didn't talk to each other before the game, because I've heard and I assume that coaches do call each other before the game so they can kind of keep it all within the range, so they can, one, have a good game, but then also have a safe game. And then also, what the most important thing is for them to be able to evaluate the players in the best positions possible.
I mean, some fans, you know how they get their anger going when they see something like that. They say, well, how come Frazier didn't just blitz them for a couple series? You know, my guess is on that one is that Frazier didn't want to play into that wheelhouse and risk injury to his people. Is that the way you see it?
Exactly. And, to be honest with you, going into that second game, probably the last 2 practices, the players are practicing what they were going to play during the game. So for Leslie Frazier to have an emotional reaction, to try to get back at Buffalo, to start calling up all these blitzes that they didn't practice and guys aren't comfortable with, would have really been counterproductive, because, one, it wouldn't have been effective, and then 2, would probably have led to even worse play by the defense. And then after the game, he would have had to answer more questions. Why were you giving up big plays? Why the defense even performed worse than they did? So I think it was something that he was a cool, calm, and collective about how he was upset, perturbed, just because he didn't like his offensive line and his quarterback to be under that type of duress. Christian Ponder and the offensive line didn't perform up to his standards, and he was very, very upset about that.
Okay. Well, we got a question actually from one of our fans, Sarah in Arizona. Her question was for you to think back in a time when you played, and I'm sure you didn't make many mistakes in your career, Jay, but her question was, from your memory of an NFL player, when you make a mistake on the field, and the one she looked at was the Vikings center John Sullivan snapped the ball to Christian Ponder before he was ready, and it went over his head. When you make a mistake like that affects a series or affects a game, how long does a mistake like that stay with you in your mind?
It really depends on the player. And I'll go back to what Sarah said. I never really made any mistakes. It was always somebody else's fault. I'm just playing. But it just depends on the player. I've been in games where I've made huge mistakes or you make small mistakes. NFL is about whoever makes the least amount of mistakes, both individually and collectively. And that's offensively, defensively, and special teams. And then also it goes into the coaching staff where they don't make mistakes in regards to the game plan, clock management, and game management. So it's a game of mistakes. So you see the teams that usually perform well over time are the teams that don't have the high amount of mistakes. So mistakes are a part of the game. I'd like to think that with Sullivan, he's a veteran player, established player. It's probably just a mishap, something that's very, very small. I think it probably happens to him maybe once a year. So I don't really think it's a big deal, and I'm pretty sure he just forgot about it.
Now, if you're not the starter like a John Sullivan, let's say you're the third-string center that happens, does it stay with you longer?
Oh, yes, it does, because when you aren't a starter in the NFL and you get some playing time and you make a mistake, it's almost 3 times worse than if a starter made it, because the coaches are comfortable with the starter. They have confidence in that starter. They've seen what he can do. When you're a rookie or the lower end of the 80-man roster and you make a mistake, they look at it like, well, you got your chance and you didn't make the most of it. So every play is magnified to the 10th degree. And I'm willing to bet, because I've been there, that every mistake that you make stays with you longer. I can remember when I was a rookie playing with the Buffalo Bills, who played the Washington Redskins in the preseason. I had a pretty good game. I had an interception. I had quite a few tackles, did well on special teams. They had a 14-play drive. I got beat on an inside route by a running back. And for the rest of the game, which only was about a quarter and a half, I was wondering if I was going to get cut before I got to the bus. So that play was magnified because I wasn't starting it at that point in time. So that hung with me all the way until that next week's game. And so you never want to have the hangover as a player, but I think when you're a young player or a player striving to make the roster, it lingers around a little bit longer.
Last week we talked about new players trying to make an impression. You talked about Desmond Bishop needing to get back on the field so that the coaches and the scouts and the teammates can see that he regained his confidence after the injury he had. Both he and Erin Henderson played some significant snaps on Friday night. What was your impression of their performance?
Well, I think Erin Henderson is a quality linebacker. I think he's learning on the job how to be a middle linebacker. I think he actually performed better than he did the week prior. I think he's only going to get better. As far as Desmond Bishop, I think that it was his first game in over a year. So he was a little hesitant at the beginning, but you could see his athletic ability. You could see his explosiveness. You can see what made him almost an all-pro wings at Green Bay. He has a knack for big plays. And I think the reason why they played both of those guys a significant amount was to see where they fit, whether Desmond moves into the middle and Henderson goes outside, or we keep Henderson in the inside and keep Desmond on the outside. So I think it was something that they were doing a lot of fact-finding, and then also was going to give them a good gauge on where these players are, not only mentally but physically, as far as how many reps can they take and perform at a high level.
You talk about the rust that Desmond Bishop has after he's been out for a season. Is there a certain number of games you would expect to take to knock that rust off?
Well, I think the rest of the preseason is big for him. He's going to play more this week, and I think that's going to be a big step for him. And then I think in the fourth game, as long as he performs well in his third game, that he's going to probably play a little bit. I think every practice rep, every practice is huge for him. And I think for him, it'll come back rather quickly. And then when the season starts, you'll see him start slow, but I think as the season goes on, second, third, fourth game, you'll see the old Desmond Bishop, barring injury, and being out there making big plays.
We talked about Christian Ponder earlier. This is obviously a big prove-it year for him, and even though the line had trouble with the blitzing and the receivers on occasion didn't do Christian any favors because they dropped a ball or two, he still didn't look very comfortable in the pocket out there. How did you view his 5 for 12 performance?
I thought it was very average. I know the receivers didn't help him out any, but I thought he had happy feet. I thought maybe he was confused just as much as the offensive line was as far as what type of blitzing scheme he was seeing from Buffalo and how to make the certain checks and the certain adjustments in order to get them in the better plays to be successful as an offense. So I think it was a learning experience for him. I don't look at it as a step back, but I think it was just a very, very average performance. I know he can play better. He knows he can play better. He stated after the game out there was a state of confusion. I'm pretty sure they spent the beginning of the first couple practices on remedying these mistakes that they had as an offense. So I look for him to really, really step up his game in this third game because this is the last time that he's going to play in the preseason before the regular season. So you can't just turn it on at the beginning of the season. You have to build up to it. So, he only played a couple snaps the first game, went 5 for 12 this game. So now I'm looking for him to be, 7 of 11, 8 of 12 with the touchdown pass and be able to move the offense more efficiently than he did last week against the Bills.
When you look at him, what we saw the first couple of years of his career, he has a propensity to bail out of the pocket, even if it looks like the protection's there, if he just stepped up into the pocket. But he tends to roll out to the right, and that cuts off half the field for him and probably half his options. What does he need to do differently to trust the pocket? And when he does break the pocket like that, what type of problems does that cause for his receivers?
Well, I think that what he needs to do is develop that confidence in his offensive line, develop that confidence in himself, and then also develop the confidence in the playbook. It's very, very imperative for him to learn to stay in the pocket, to be the pocket passer that he got drafted to be, and only use his feet when need be, and be very, very smart about it. Because if he takes one hit and he's out for the season or out for a significant amount of time, that affects not only him, but then the offense. By him rolling out to the right majority of the time, yes, it does cut off the field, but I like to look at it, well, if it cuts off half the field, then he knows that he only has 2 options on that side of the field. But what it does is, now everybody has the playbook on Christian Ponder. So instead of people blitzing him from his blind side, they will blitz him from his front side. So therefore, he'll have to either step up in the pocket or he's going to take an astronomical amount of sacks, which wouldn't be effective for the offense in the long run anyhow.
We're running into the time of the year to where we're getting real close to making decisions on who makes this roster and who doesn't. And I always liken the NFL being like a company that downsizes not only every year, but multiple times a year. And in a corporate environment, when that happens, if you say you're going to downsize, a full 2/3 of the organization thinks it's going to affect them. When you look at the 80 players on the roster for the Vikings, or really any NFL roster, how many of those 80 people are worried right now about their future in the NFL?
I would say out of the 80, at least 25 to 30. I think when teams show up to training camp, if you take the kickers out, so then you have just, the specialty guys out, that means you have 50 guys on the roster. I think 45 positions are pretty much solidified by the time teams go to camp. So that leaves 5 positions for 37 players, or 37 different players. So I think a lot of guys are sitting on pins and needles. It's a very, very stressful time, but then also it's a very, very exciting time if you're able to make it through that last cut and then obviously make it through the rest of the season, because it's everybody's dream on that 80-man roster to be an NFL player. Some guys, it might not work out with the Vikings. It might get on with another team, or this might be their last stop or their only stop. So it's definitely a stressful time. I know these guys aren't sleeping well. I've been there and done that, and I definitely don't miss those days and nights. But I think it's something that they have to really, really embrace and really, really let it motivate them to go out there in these last 2 preseason games and really show the powers that be and the coaching staff what type of player they are.
Yeah, I can't imagine for that fringe player. I wouldn't want to be that guy, that's for sure. I know you looked a little bit at the first-string defensive line on Friday night. What were your impressions of the line play, and are there specific players who stuck out in your mind as either being particularly impressive or that seemed to struggle a little bit?
Well, I think that the Vikings starting defensive line is rock solid. And I think over the last 8 years, the Vikings front 4 has been one of the best, if not the best, in the NFL. So I think The starters are rock solid. They all look good. I'm very, very interested to see Everett Dawkins play this week, see Chase Baker play, and Anthony McLeod. With Christian Ballard out and Floyd having, his minor knee surgery, usually teams only keep 4 interior defensive linemen. With this happening and not knowing when Christian Ballard is going to come back, because he is a player that would be in the rotation, I think the Vikings are going to have to keep 1 or 2 guys extra. So I don't know if it's going to be an extra defensive lineman on the interior and then 1 guy on practice squad. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how they play going into those last game, because it's going to be a full display. They need to play them all. I don't really see them playing LaTroy Guyon and Kevin Williams that much because they know what they can do. I see them rotating a lot of the younger players, the Bakers, Dawkins, Fred Evans is established veteran, and McLeod and Spencer Neely in there to see what they can do and see who's going to step up for that 1 regular roster spot and that practice squad roster spot.
It's actually good for the fans to know about, because the glamour spot tends to be the ends, because they're typically rushing the quarterback. So that gives everybody kind of a homework assignment against San Francisco to watch that interior.
Yeah, and if you look, the prima donnas are the outside rushers with the Jared Allens, the Brian Robisons, and the Griffins. But really the nuts and bolts and what fans should really concentrate on this week is the interior and see who plays this week, because that's going to go far on telling the fans who's going to make this roster and who's going to help out at the beginning of the season. Because if the season started today, you don't have anybody behind Williams and Guyon that's really established, except for Fred Evans. And you're going to need 1 more person to play, because very rarely does an NFL team go into a game with 3 interior defensive linemen. So it's got to be, if Fred Evans is somewhat of a lock to make the team, it's going to be between Dawkins, Baker, and Neely and McLeod to claim 1 spot. So I think it's going to be an exciting game for that interior defensive line to show what they can do.
Well, based on what we asked before about those 80 players thinking about their roster spot, we probably have a lot of interior defensive linemen who aren't sleeping this week, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty sure they're staying up a little bit later studying film and running through the plays and the game in order to go out there and perform well. It's a stressful time, but I think it's, an exciting time because the opportunity is there. However you get your opportunity in the NFL, it doesn't matter. It's all about what you do when you get the opportunity. So the opportunity is there for those 4 young gentlemen, plus Fred Evans, to step in and get a roster spot, then also help the Vikings out for what we hope is a great season.
I'm going to challenge your defensive mind, Jay. In 2013, the Vikings intend to run a lot of 2 tight end offense. What challenges does a 2 tight end offense present for defenses?
Well, I think now it's morphed into the Patriots, and everybody's trying to copy the Patriots. So what that does to a defense, one, it causes matchup problems, not only from a coverage standpoint, because the tight ends are so big and so fast that a linebacker in this day and age is going to be outsized by the tight ends, and then also athletically, they're just right on par with the linebacker. But then if you want to guard them with the safety, they're bigger than safety, so then therefore they can catch a lot of passes over and above the safety. And then also in the run game, you have 2 inline blockers if you put them both into the line of scrimmage, and then therefore it's going to dictate what type of coverage you can run and also what type of fronts you can run as a defensive personnel. And then with a running back like Adrian Peterson, when you only can have 1 safety that can help in the run game, I think it's going to only help him make them miss and also put up big yards like he did last year.
When you were playing linebacker in the NFL, did you prefer to see a team with 1 tight end or 2 tight ends? Which one bothered you more?
I preferred the 1 tight end. And the reason why is because when there's 1 tight end in the game, generally that's where they run a lot of the run plays. Generally that is the passing strength. With 2 tight ends in the game, they can move him in the backfield and he can line up as a fullback. Then he's a problem coming out the backfield. If he's big enough and physical enough, he can come on lead blocking. But then also those 2 tight ends in the game totally changes your game plan from a front standpoint and a coverage standpoint. So I think it puts a lot of stress not only on the defensive line, the linebackers, but then also the safety. And better yet, it puts a lot of stress on the coaches because they're trying to match up the coverage and the front to their personnel. But when you have 2 tight ends, you can run a lot of personnel and let a lot of personnel groupings against the defense and really expose the defense. And that's what's been happening in the NFL, not only with the Vikings this year, but with the Patriots been doing it for the last couple of years. And you see Philadelphia copying them. You see the Cincinnati Bengals copying them. So it's a big matchup problem.
Everybody always talks about the third preseason game is the one. That's your dress rehearsal. That's where you want to be your sharpest for the regular season. What should fans be looking for in the game against the 49ers in order to feel comfortable that the Vikings are ready for the season opener?
Well, you should look for the majority of the starters to play at least 2.5 quarters. And what I mean by that, they'll play all the way until halftime. And depending on how they perform, they'll play 1 or 2 series in the third quarter. What the fans can really take a look at is through the first 3 quarters, the players that play is going to be 95% of the players that are going to make your final roster, which is good because then you'll be able to see what they can and can't do, and you'll see a better product out there as far as the team because the coaches are going to game plan like it's a regular game because this is their last dress rehearsal before they get into a true game week. You'll see the players prepare like more of it's a first regular season game, and you'll see a lot more intensity because this is the last time for the players and the coaches and the coaching staff to really knock off that rush. So I'm excited to see how the Vikings come out there and perform because you usually see a big jump from the second game to the third game as far as execution, play calling, team-wise, and then also performance-wise. So I'm excited to see which players obviously step up for the Vikings and play well in their third game, preseason game, but then also see what young guys make a name for themselves and then hopefully lock down a roster spot by doing so.
Well, folks, believe it or not, that wraps up another edition of Jay Foreman's All Out Blitz. And while we always want to remind you to submit your questions that you want Jay to answer in the future podcast, we've got something a little special for you that we're going to try next week. With the final preseason game being on a Thursday, Jay will give his thoughts on the game against the 49ers and give a preview for the final preseason game. But then we're also going to return on Friday after the game, and Jay's going to take a look at what he expects to happen on cutdown day for the Vikings. So something real unique that we're going to have, and I think that's going to be fun for everybody. So until next week, I'm Tom Moore.
And I'm Jay Foreman.
So long, everyone.